Chapter 24, Section O, The South in the Age of Industry. So, the industrial tidal wave, so to speak, that hit the North after the Civil War really missed the South. The South does not really take hold of the Industrial Revolution. We see it remaining mostly rural and agriculturally based. And with that agriculture, the plantation system is more or less over with. Okay, instead of a plantation system, we now have the system of sharecropping and tenant farming. However, a saving grace that does come to the South is the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry really takes off in the 1880s because there's an invention of a machine that rolls cigarettes. So instead of having to roll each cigarette by hand, there's a machine that now does it. It really boosts the economy for the South because it really boosts the tobacco economy. It wasn't a huge deal, but it was something. The guy who really takes charge of the tobacco industry, his name is James Buchanan Duke, right? So he's the namesake of Duke University in North Carolina. And what he does, he kind of mirrors what he's seeing in the North, and he starts to absorb smaller tobacco companies. So when it's all said and done, his tobacco company really is the end-all be-all. He really kind of corners the market, although that's not the correct term, but he really takes over the tobacco industry in the South. Okay, and like I said, the South stayed overwhelmingly rural at this time. There were some people who tried to, light a fire under the South. There's a guy, his name was Henry Grady. Henry Grady was the editor of an Atlanta newspaper, and he really extorted, the ex-Confederates to outplay the North in the industrial game. But it was not to be. And there were some barriers that prevented the South from really joining in the industry game. One reason was there's a lot of discrimination against the South in the North. For example, railroads had a system where manufactured goods being transported from north to south had a much better rate than manufactured goods that were shipped south to north. People in the North really wanted to make sure the South kept its role as the producer of raw materials for the Northeast. A more specific example of this kind of railroad tomfoolery that was happening. So there's some deposits of coal and iron ore found near Birmingham, Alabama. So this would have been an excellent opportunity for the South to build up their steel industry, right? It makes sense if you have, a coal iron ore mine that you could build a factory to refine it nearby. It just makes sense. However, the steel lords in Pittsburgh put pressure on the railroads, so no matter where the iron from this Birmingham mine went, so no matter where they shipped it, it would be charged as if it had been shipped all the way to Pittsburgh, if that makes sense. So really, it's taking away any advantage that the South would have had due to its location. So we see some kind of trickery happening within the railroad system that really, helps or really prevents the South from developing its own industry. Right. Besides, the steel industry, the industry that really does take hold in the South somewhat is the textile industry. Right? Bring the mills to the cotton. Why are we shipping cotton all the way up north when we could create mills in the South? Well, what happens is the 1880s, cotton mills start to spring up in the South, and they start to be built in the South for a couple of reasons. One, because of some tax benefits, but two, there was a big labor supply in the South. The South's economy wasn't so hot, so they could find some cheap, non-unionized labor in the South. And a lot of times these cotton mills would be built in really poor areas. Specifically, there's a poor area called the Piedmont region, and that's in South Appalachia. Okay, so a lot of these poor white mountain folks are kind of pouring out of the mountains to fulfill or to get some of these jobs in the textile mills. Okay, they would live in mill towns. Okay, so these towns would kind of spring up around the mills, and the mill more or less would own everything in the town, from the school, if there was a school, to the grocery store. And a lot of times the prices at the grocery store would be very high. And the grocery store was more than willing to lend credit. So a lot of times people would, get further and further into debt to the company store. But, although these hillbillies, quote unquote, got paid about half the wage of their northern counterparts, it was still better than nothing. It was the only really steady jobs available, and it allowed families to remain together because these mills not only hired men, but they also employed women and children. Section P, the impact of the new Industrial Revolution on America. Okay, so the impact of the revolution, the Industrial Revolution, here we go. So, the standard of living in general, regardless of what everyone's going to tell you, it increased. Okay, an industrial worker in America typically had a more comfortable life than an industrial worker pretty much anywhere else. Cities grew as factories were built, demanding more and more labor. Immigrants more or less swarmed to these new factories that were being built to, find employment. Jefferson's ideal that we talked about before of having, a nation of small farmers who were their own boss, well, that was slowly disappearing as manufacturing took hold. We see the federal government stepping into the realm of economics, into the realm of business more and more. Not only are they controlling the rate of the tariff, but we see them taking a more prominent role in trying to break up some of these monopolies, some of these big trusts. And, immigrants whose lives never revolved around time before, that switched rather quickly because now they are kind of they had to regiment their lives according to the factory whistle. So people who never owned a clock, who the time was not even a part of their day, now, they're in America, they're part of the factory system. They were on a time schedule, and a strict one at that. So that was kind of a big change for a lot of immigrants as well. But out of any social group, the group that had their lives most profoundly impacted by this new industrial revolution were women. As we talked about before, there were new inventions like the telephone and the typewriter, and these two new inventions, specifically telephone and the typewriter, really created millions of jobs for women. And, they would work as secretaries, they would be in control of the switchboard for the telephone, becoming telephone operators, that sort of thing. And there was kind of this romanticized ideal at this time of the new independent woman. There was an illustrator whose name was Dana Gibson, and she illustrated this famous picture of the Gibson girl. If you want to see it, it's in your book. But the Gibson girl was this idealized independent woman who was strong, beautiful, athletic, had her life together. Reality was that was just a pretty picture. That was just an ideal. Most of the women who worked didn't work because they found it glamorous or because they wanted their independence. Mostly women worked because of financial need. They had to make ends meet one way or the other. And, a lot of them were forced into working long hours in dangerous conditions. And plus, they were paid less than their male counterparts. So it wasn't really this glamorous new life for women, even though more jobs opened up for them. All right. Also, the age of industry we see really highlights the growing gap between the haves and the have-nots. And it's made even worse when these newly rich folks start flaunting their wealth, start bedecking their wives in diamonds. And that really creates some bitter resentment. Because in 1910, for example, about 1/10, or the top 1/10 of the population, owned about 9/10 or 90% of the nation's wealth. So we really see an unbalance in who has the money. Also, we see a shift like we've kind of recognized before. So instead of having a nation of independent farmers, now people are more and more becoming employees. For example, in 1860, about half of the workers were working for wages. Half the people were working for wages. So by 1900, that number increased to about two-thirds. So in 1860, about half of workers were working for wages, and by 1900, two-thirds of workers were working for wages. And of course, that reflects people leaving farms and becoming more and more employed in the industry. However, when you're working for wages, you could become more vulnerable in a number of different ways. For example, you're more sensitive to changes in the economy, right? You could lose your job if things turned south. Also, kind of you're at the mercy of the whim of your boss. Your boss doesn't like you, you're fired. Okay? And if the breadwinner in your family became ill or was injured, that could equal a catastrophe for your family. Okay, so you became very vulnerable if you became a wage worker. So there was a lot of people starting to have kind of rumbles for reforms. They wanted some sort of job protection. They wanted some sort of provision if they were temporarily unemployed. So we have the kind of the startings or the rumblings of what we'll see blossoms into unions. Section Q. In unions, there is strength. All right, we're talking about unions. Okay, so it's really the workers, right, who are doing the hard work, who were spending their sweat, spending their lives working, and they really propelled this industrial revolution forward. But they didn't share the profits. And they really felt like they were the cog in the machine, kind of nameless folks. Creativity, originality, that's becoming less valued. Now you're just kind of seen as a worker, period. A lot of new machines were taking place of the skilled worker, leaving a lot of jobs to the unskilled worker. And because there are plenty of laborers around, employers are not giving competitive wages. Because if you don't want the job, they'll find someone else to do it cheaper anyway. That sort of idea. And of course, we see hundreds of thousands of immigrants flooding in as well. So workers are really becoming expendable, easy to replace. So you don't have a lot of influence to work with here because you're so replaceable. If you had a strike, your union went on strike, the company could hire strikebreakers. Also, they could hire thugs. Your book actually uses that term. It was glorious. They could hire thugs, to beat up labor organizers. 1886, we see Jay Gould. We're talking about him again. All right, a very famous robber baron. He was quoted to say, "I can hire half of the working class to kill the other half." So you could see when it came to union versus corporation relations, corporations definitely had the upper hand. Okay. Along with this, we know that the Supreme Court and courts in general were more supportive of corporations. They're kind of on the corporation side. So the courts could issue an injunction to stop strikes. And if things got really disorderly, corporations could request that federal troops or state troops be brought in. Okay, so the courts are on the corporation side for sure. And employers looked and employers also could lock their doors against rebellious workers. So, if workers were starting to form a union, starting to demand things, something very simple the corporation could do was literally shut the doors, close for business, and watch as all of these labor want to be union folks kind of starve to death, and finally they would cave in, say, "We're sorry, we won't do that again." They'd open the doors, they'd get paid again, life would go on. And that was called a lockout, when employers would literally lock the door and kind of starve their workers into submission. Also, sometimes companies would force new hires to sign something called yellow dog contracts. Okay, and these contracts would promise that they wouldn't join a union. And also, if you were a troublemaker, if you were someone who was starting to organize labor unions, you might be blacklisted. And if you were blacklisted, pretty much no one would hire you. You were in a dire situation. So, really, we see companies really have the upper hand. Also, some corporations owned the company town. So, besides just having a factory, a whole town would kind of be built around it. And like we mentioned before with the textile industry in the South, they would own the grocery store and they would lend money, and you would become in debt and you'd just kind of be stuck in this perpetual debt to the company store. Not the best thing ever. Carnegie and Rockefeller had battled their way to the top, so it was assumed that a common laborer could do likewise. And plus, strikes to the Americans at this time tasted funny. It seemed very socialist, very foreign, kind of un-American, because you were thinking, if you really wanted to apply yourselves, you could become the next Carnegie. You could become the next Rockefeller. So unions just had a bad taste with Americans at this time. It was kind of funny because it was a paradox, right? Because we see these big businesses could combine into trusts to increase their prices for their goods, to increase their profits, but workers couldn't join forces into creating unions to increase their wages. So we kind of see that double standard, sort of speak there. Section R. Labor limps along. Okay, so in the next couple sections here, we're going to be looking at 3 different attempts to build a national union. Okay, so 3 different attempts. So let's talk about it a little bit. Before the Civil War, there had been some unions, but there were few and far between, very disorganized. But after the Civil War, after 600,000 men die, there's that drain on human resources, so to speak, really put a premium on labor. In 1872, we see that there are several hundred thousand organized workers, or people who belong to unions, and we have about 32 national unions. And the biggest example of a national union right away after the Civil War is something called the National Labor Union. Okay? The National Labor Union was organized or was created in 66, and they wanted to unify workers of different trades. So, the railroad workers, the bricklayers, the textile workers, they really wanted to unite them all and create kind of just this one big labor union. It lasted about 6 years, so not so bad, and at its height it had about 600,000 members. But what really killed the National Labor Union was the economic depression we see taking hold in the 1870s. Because of this depression in the 1870s, it really hit home, and people were less willing to stick their necks out. Okay. But after the depression, we see the rise of a new union. Okay, the National Labor Union is kind of replaced by a group called the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor interestingly enough, kind of started out as a secret society, right? They had passwords, they had a secret handshake, that sort of thing. But the Knights of Labor, even more than the National Labor Union, they wanted to create this giant, huge union, okay? Men would be in it, women would be in it, skilled workers, unskilled workers, blacks and whites, all united. The Knights of Labor didn't really get into politics much, but they were really kind of striving for, pushing for economic and social reform. They wanted, safety and health codes. Their big cry was 8-hour workday. They really, really wanted that 8-hour workday. Because at this time, typically people would be working 10 plus hours every day. The Knights of Labor were led by Irishman Terence V. And the Knights led a number of successful strikes to get an 8-hour workday, including one against Jay Gould's Wabash Railroad. So they were successful in some respects, but they eventually were brought down. So that leads us to the next section, Section S. So just in review, like I said, we're going to be talking about 3 different unions. The first one's the National Labor Union. That's brought down, unfortunately, by the Depression in the 1870s. After that, we get to the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor was really the most inclusive. So they had, women, men, blacks, whites, skilled, unskilled laborers, that sort of thing. So the Knights of Labor, they were organizing or involved in organizing a lot of May Day strikes in the May of 1886. So May 1st, they're organizing a bunch of strikes across the country. However, one of these strikes really, became a hot mess. And this strike happened in Chicago. This whole event I'm going to be talking about here is called the Haymarket Square Riot or the Haymarket Square Bombing, whichever one you choose. They both work. So anyway, one of the May Day rallies in Chicago turned violent when somebody, we still don't know who, threw a dynamite bomb into the middle of a meeting, and this kills about several dozen people. So the Chicago police, not knowing, who to charge, round up and arrest 8 anarchists, people who were against government. So they round up these eight anarchists and arrest them, even though there's hardly any evidence linking them to the bombing, and they end up sentencing 3 of them to prison terms, and the rest of them, the 5 remaining, were sentenced to death, although one of them committed suicide before they were hung. Anyway, it was a hot mess. 6 years later, the Democratic governor in Illinois pardoned the 3 men who were in prison, but still, it was really brought down the Knights of Labor, because this Haymarket Square mess and these anarchists were somehow linked in the public mind to the Knights of Labor. So any further strikes the Knights of Labor tried to attempt, they were just kind of unsuccessful. And then the death blow came to the Knights of Labor when the skilled workers that had been a part of the Knights of Labor kind of broke away and formed their own union. So these skilled workers are breaking away and they're forming the 3rd union we're going to be talking about, and that's the American Federation of Labor. Like I said, it was the final blow to the Knights. The Knights gradually kind of disappeared. They fused with other groups, but we really don't see a lot with the Knights of Labor in the future. All right, last section, Section T, the AF of L to the fore. Let me translate that, right? The AF of L is the American Federation of Labor to the fore, like to the foreground. Hooray. Anyway, the American Federation of Labor was created in 1886. It was the brainchild of Samuel Gompers. Samuel Gompers had been a Jewish cigar maker, but he was elected to be president of the AFL many, many, many times. Every year they had a new election, and for like 25 years he was elected to be president. He's very well liked. Anyway, what it was is, according to its title, right, American Federation of Labor. It was a federation. So it was really an association of smaller independent unions. So the bricklayers had a union, the I guess cigar makers had a union, that sort of thing. So these smaller unions kind of created this federation to work for similar causes. Um, something unique about the AFL is they really avoided general social reforms, right? The Knights of Labor were all about creating social reforms. The AFL, they were more like, we're just going to take this slow. They were more down to earth and, trying to not create sweeping social reforms, but, they slowly were working to get more, right? They wanted better wages. They wanted better hours. They wanted better working conditions. Just simple things. One of their major goals, the AFL, was to create closed shops. What a closed shop is where anyone hired in a certain place had to belong to that union. So kind of looking at the extreme opposite of the yellow dog contracts. Remember, those yellow dog contracts said that if you were going to be hired, you couldn't join a union. Well, what the AFL was trying to do was form the opposite idea, a closed shop. A closed shop was that if you were hired to a certain factory, for example, you had to join the union factory. So that's what the AFL was really working toward. To accomplish their goals, they would pool their funds together in order to ride out prolonged strikes, that sort of thing. The only shortcoming the AFL had was that they only represented skilled workers, and within there it was only white men. So really a small proportion of all unionized folks could be a part of the AFL. Everyone else had to fend for themselves. So by 1900, the AFL had about 500,000 members, and critics called it, right, the labor trust. But still, when all was said and done, this is just the beginning of the labor movement, really. Only about 3% of workers in the United States in 1900 were actually a part of the union. But part of a union, I should say. But the AFL was probably the most effective union we see after the Civil War, and definitely has the longest lasting impact we'll see. So, when all is said and done, during this time we see some changes. People in general, the American public, are more willing to accept unions. Organized labor had developed a more positive image in the public eye. In 1894, we see Congress creating Labor Day as a legal holiday, which is a plus for the unions. And we also see some industrialists, I should say, some of them found it more economical just to bargain with the unions than continually to fight them. Although the vast majority continued to fight them, we see some industrialists just kind of going along and would work with the unions. But we will still have to wait a number of decades before we really see labor coming or gaining equal footing with businesses. So this is really just kind of a jumping off point for the unions. And with that, I think that is the end of chapter 24.